So my name's Tariqua. I'm a third-year student in the Sustainable Development PhD program at Columbia. I'll be moderating this session, which is around the theme of economic and financial stability under a changing climate. So as we know, scientists are predicting that global temperatures are expected to rise over the coming century. As well, natural disasters are going to have higher frequency or higher intensity or both in the coming years. So given these prospects, it is of course very important to study how the macroeconomic stability and finance sectors are going to be affected. Now, unfortunately, in the economics literature as well as in finance, these topics haven't been, at the forefront of researchers' focus or even practitioners' focus until, very recent years. This is changing, especially in the finance literature, thanks to the work of pioneers like Professor Harrison Hong, who we have the pleasure of hearing from today. So today in this session, we'll have 3 papers. We'll learn about climate stress testing and the kind of systemic risk that climate change, as well as changing policy about climate and about the environment, poses to the financial sector. We'll also talk about labor reallocation and how climate change and labor mobility will be affected due to global warming. Lastly, we'll also talk about the considerations and alternatives of the social planner to mitigate disaster risk and also optimize social welfare in the face of climate change. So our 3 speakers will be, first, we'll have Dr. Hae-Yoon Jung. She's a financial economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Second, we'll have Jose Luis Cruz. Dr. Cruz, he actually just defended his dissertation in economics. Yes, he defended just 2 days ago, so I assume he also has vodka in his bottle. So Dr. Cruz, he'll be doing a postdoc at Berkeley and then heading to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, starting as a research economist in fall of 2023. Lastly, we'll have Professor Harrison Hong, who is the John R. Eckel Jr. Professor of Financial Economics at Columbia University. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. So housekeeping notes, each presenter has 45 minutes. They'll talk for 30 minutes. So if you have questions, please hold them until they finish their talk. We'll have 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of each session. And please go to the mics to ask your questions. So thank you very much. Without further ado, I invite Dr. Jung to the stage.
Thank you so much for a nice introduction, and thank you very much for having me today. So I'm very excited to present my paper, Climate Stress Testing. This is joint work with Rob Engel and Richard Berner at NYU Stern, and the disclaimer applies. So understanding the impact of climate change on financial stability is a very important question for researchers, banks, and regulators alike. And how could climate-related shocks impose systemic risk on the financial sector if banks systemically suffer large losses following a sharp increase in either transition risk or physical risk? Then climate change can affect financial stability. Just to be on the same page, by transition risk, I mean the risks that come from changes in policies or technologies or preferences as economies move into less carbon-intensive environment. And by physical risk, I mean the risks that come from damages to property following extreme weather events or longer-term changes in climate patterns. And one of the key questions here is about quantification. So how much systemic risk does climate change impose on financial stability? That's the research question of our paper. And before I jump into the model, let me briefly discuss some of the common challenges in climate stress testing and try to explain how we try to address them. So first of all, analysis based on the past climate events may not effectively capture the changes in the perception of risk. And this is because first, market expectations can change without a direct experience of climate change events. And also, asset prices today can reflect the changes in future climate risk, even though the damages are decades away. So we use a market-based methodology, which allows us to fully incorporate changes in the market's expectations. And second, climate risk itself changes over time, and how firms, banks, and market respond to the perceived risk also changes over time. So to this end, we estimate our model dynamically, so we allow for volatilities and correlations to be time varying. And lastly, our methodology only requires publicly available information, and we estimate our model on a daily basis. So we hope that our measure can be a useful complement to other stress testing methodologies as well as scenario analysis. So in this paper, we developed a climate stress testing methodology to test the resilience of financial institutions to climate-related risks. And our market-based methodology involves 3 steps. The first step is to measure the climate risk factor. And the second step is to estimate the time-varying climate beta of banks. So the climate beta of each bank will capture the exposure of the bank to the climate risk factor that we estimated in the first step. And once we have the climate beta measure of each bank, then we can compute the systemic climate risk, which we call C risk. And the C risk is defined as the expected capital shortfall of banks in a climate stress scenario. And we apply this methodology to large global banks to understand their climate-related risk exposure. So here are the summary of our key findings. So first of all, we find that the climate beta and C risk went up substantially during 2020. In terms of magnitude, the aggregate C risk of the top 4 US banks was about $360 billion, which is about 40% of their market cap. So we decomposed this increase to understand what was going on. And in a decomposition analysis, we find that the increase in C risk during 2020 was primarily due to equity deterioration rather than debt deterioration or increase in risk itself. So we thought this might mean that the banks were already under stress in 2020 without any climate stress. So that led us to think about the C risk measure compared to the non-C risk measure. So the non-C risk measure is simply capital shortfall under 0 climate stress scenario, and we call the differential marginal C risk. And we find that the aggregate marginal C risk of the top 4 US banks was about $245 billion. So this suggests that the effect of climate stress can be substantial. And lastly, we find that banks with higher exposure to brown loans have higher climate beta and C risk, which corroborates the economic validity of our measure. So now let me explain each step in a detail. So the first step is to come up with a climate risk factor. And there can be multiple ways to do this, but we use a market-based measure. We use stranded asset portfolio return as a measure of transition risk. So the idea behind this is that the fossil fuels are likely to be stranded assets in the future. So we use this as a measure of transition risk. This portfolio was developed by Robert Litterman, and it is composed of 30% long position in energy ETF and 70% long position in coal ETF, and it's normalized by S&P 500 index. And the World Wildlife Fund, where Robert Litterman is chairing, they're using this, they're shorting this portfolio to get a climate hedge. So what you see here is the cumulative performance on the stranded asset portfolio, and you can see that it has been pretty much falling one way since 2011 to 2021. And we interpret this underperformance of stranded asset portfolio return as a rise in transition risk. And for the time period when the coal ETF was not available, which is marked as gray line, for that time period, we used the average return on the top 4 coal companies. So this is our climate risk factor. And once we have a measure of climate risk factor, then we can estimate each bank's climate beta. So climate beta measures bank stock return sensitivity to the climate risk factor that we just measured in the previous step. And we model the bank stock return with two factors. The first factor is market factor, and the second factor is climate factor from the previous step. And we call the loading on the second factor the climate beta. And we estimate this dynamically, so we allow for volatility and correlation to be time varying. And we estimate this on a daily basis. And in general, we expect the climate beta to be positive for large banks because large banks have large exposure to brown loans. And here are the climate beta of the US banks. I'm plotting the climate betas of the top 10 US banks. And first of all, you can see that the climate betas move around, which suggests that it's important to estimate this dynamically, especially given the time-varying nature of climate change. And in time series, you can see that climate beta started off from 0 in the early 2000s, and they went to slightly negative territory during the early financial crisis, and they were on the rise, and you can see that there was a substantial increase in 2020. And we did the same exercise for other countries as well, and this pattern was common for other countries, including Canada, France, Japan, or the UK. So once we have the climate betas, then we can compute C risk, which is the expected capital shortfall conditional on climate stress. And the C risk depends on first D, which is the book value of debt, and W, which is the market capitalization of the bank, and then long-run marginal expected shortfall, LRMES, which is the expected equity loss conditional on climate stress. And K is the prudential level of equity relative to assets, and we set it as 8%, and 5.5% for European banks to account for accounting differences. And the theta is the climate stress level, and we calibrate it to 50% because negative 50% is the 1% quantile of the 6-month return distribution of the stranded asset portfolio. So we are considering an extreme scenario. And here I'm plotting the C risks of the top 10 US banks. And first of all, the positive numbers mean that there was an expected capital shortfall, and negative numbers can be interpreted as excess reserves. And you can see 3 peaks. The first 2 were around the global financial crisis and the European financial crisis. And the last peak was during 2020. And I would like to point out that because C risk is not a sole function of climate beta, if bank is sufficiently capitalized, then a bank with high climate beta in earlier plot may have low C risk. And this pattern was also common across countries, and the sharp increase in C risk during 2020 was common in particular. So we zoomed into 2020 and see what happened. So what you see on the left-hand side is the C risk of the top 10 US banks, and you can see that the C risk went up very sharply at the end of the first quarter. For instance, the green one is Citibank, and the C risk went up from $20 billion to almost $100 billion. And we looked at the cross-section. So what you see on the right-hand side is the loan exposure to gas and oil industry. And this is based on public data. This is based on syndicated loan origination data. And you can see that although the 2 rankings are not perfectly aligned, but still they are quite consistent. The top 4 banks in terms of the C risk were Citibank, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and JP Morgan, and those are the top 4 banks on the right-hand side table. So the takeaway in the slide is that a bank with higher exposure to gas and oil loan had higher C risk during 2020. And we decompose the increase in C risk into three components. And the first component is the contribution of debt deterioration to increase in C risk. And the second component is coming from the equity deterioration. And the last part is capturing the effect of higher volatility or correlation. And here is the decomposition table for the US banks. So the first column is C risk at the end of 2019, and the second column is at the end of 2020. The third column is the change during year 2020. And if I add up the top four numbers, then they add up to $364 billion, which is about 40% of their market cap. And the next three columns are the decomposition. And you can see that the equity deterioration component was more than 75% of the total increase in C risk. So this might suggest that the increase in C risk during 2020 was because banks were undercapitalized and they were vulnerable to climate risk as well as other risks. So that led us to think about the marginal C risk. So what you see here, I'm plotting the difference between the C risk and non-stress C risk. And you can see that the gap opened up during 2019, and they remain high. And the top four banks' marginal C risk was about $245 billion. So this suggests that the effect of climate stress could be substantial. And here I'm comparing the magnitude of marginal C risk with marginal S risk. So the marginal S risk in navy line is capturing the effect of market stress, and the red line is marginal C risk, and that's capturing the effect of climate stress. And you can see that for these top four banks, the marginal C risk, the effect of climate stress, was about half of marginal S risk, which is capturing the effect of market stress. And our last analysis was based on the Y14 data, which has granular information on the loan portfolio of large banks. And what you see here is the binned scatter plot of climate beta on the y-axis and the brown loan share on the x-axis. And we define brown loan as the loans that were made to the firms that belong to the top 30 industries by carbon emissions. And these are based on this time period from 2012 to 2021. And you can see the positive relationship. Banks with higher loan exposure to industries with high emissions had higher climate betas. And we tested this formally with regression analysis. So we regressed the quarterly climate beta on the brown loan share. That's the first specification. And you can confirm the positive relationship. And we also tried including bank characteristics as control variables, including the variables listed here. That's the second specification. And the third and fourth specification at the bank fixed effect and year fixed effect as well. And interestingly, you can see that the brown loan share is positively related to the climate beta. And we also looked at the probability of default of the brown industries, and we compared that to the other industries. So the red line is the average probability of default for the loans that were made to the brown industries, and the blue one is all the rest of the industries. And you can see that, of course, the average probability of default went up for all industries during 2020, but you can see that the brown industries PD went up much more sharply during the first 2 quarters of 2020. And actually, the spread started to widen up even before 2020. And we thought this can help explain the sharp increase in climate beta that I showed you in the earlier plot. So we ran a regression. So here we are regressing the climate beta again on the brown loan share as well as the spread between these two lines. So that's the PD brown minus PD non-brown. And we consider this as a common factor. So this is going to explain the time series variation. And you can see that as expected, these are explaining the variation in climate beta. And more interestingly, after controlling for the probability of default differential, the brown loan share is still significant and positive across the specification. So this suggests that the exposure, which is measured by the brown loan share, as well as the risk of the brown loan, which is measured by the probability of default differential, they both explain the variations in the climate beta, which we think makes sense. And these are very recent results. So we wanted to show you that our framework is flexible to incorporate other scenarios. So for instance, we constructed an emission-based factor. So it's constructed by weighting the stock return by market value within industry and weighting the industry return by emissions, carbon emissions. And this result is marginal C risk, and this is based on the emission-based factor. And we find that the marginal C risks were even higher if we use the emission-based factor instead. And we think we can associate this factor with a stylized version of carbon tax, because when the carbon tax is introduced, then the firms with high carbon emission will be mostly negatively affected. And we also considered another scenario. We constructed brown minus green factor. So brown portfolio is the emission-weighted average industry return, just same as the earlier one. And green portfolio, we use the iClean iShares Global Clean Energy ETF return. And we think we can associate this factor with a stylized version of carbon tax combined with green subsidy. And based on this factor, we find that the marginal C risks were somewhat lower. So it seems that there is a mitigating effect, but we do not have a clear explanation at this point. And the last one is testing for the climate risk besides stranded assets. So here we use a factor, a climate efficient factor mimicking portfolio. So this portfolio gains value when there is a green news. So it's based on the sustainable funds that are correlated with green news. And we take the negative sign of this hedge portfolio, so it becomes risk. And based on this factor, the marginal C risks are not that high, which suggests that the climate risk besides stranded assets may be low because this factor is after controlling for the stranded assets and oil and gas as well. So we are not arguing that the stranded asset portfolio is the best factor to be used, and you can other scenarios can also be considered using different factors. And we did more robustness analysis, and this is one of them. Here we tried including interest rate factors because that could be important factors for the bank stock returns. And after controlling for the two interest rate factors, the climate beta plots look very close to our earlier results, which suggests that our results are robust to including additional factors. And we we have more robustness tests in our paper in terms of using slightly different alternatives for market factor and climate factor. And also we tested for robustness to some estimation procedures, and we find that our results are very robust. So to conclude, we developed a measure called C-risk, and we hope that this measure could be a useful complement to other stress testing methodologies or scenario analysis. And we find that the climate beta, both exposure and risk of brown loans, explain the variation in the climate beta. Thank you.
Very much, Hae-yoon. So we'll open it up to questions now. Yeah, you can walk up to the mics.
Hi, so really, really interesting paper. I'm not sure I quite got, or I wanted to invite you to talk more about the meaning of climate risk that's driving the analysis. So if I correctly understood it, climate risk in the analysis is really measured in terms of it's really a factor of your exposure to loans to fossil fuel companies.
Right.
And you're assuming that the value of, the assumption seems to be if you have a high exposure, the risk is that these fossil fuel assets underlying those loans are going to basically drop to nothing very suddenly in 1 year or something, like very, very suddenly. Okay. So I just wanted to understand why you make that, like if I'm correctly understanding things, and why you make that assumption, because it doesn't seem entirely plausible. So how would you compare that assumption to alternative assumptions, which is that these fossil fuels become eliminated more over time? They become eliminated gradually over time between now and 2050. And that there could be spikes in the value. Like, for example, if you did the analysis now, at the height of the Ukraine war, some of these, I wonder what you think the analysis would look like now when some of these fossil fuel assets could be quite valuable if they're located in North America, for example. So, and then, so anyway, a sort of related point is I think this is really interesting effort to try to quantify this, and I wonder what else, how else would you try to measure, if you had more data? And I'm just curious, what other things would you try to do to try to figure out the climate risk in the financial system? Because, for example, I wonder, could some of these banks be mitigating some of their risks from lending to fossil fuel companies by lending to, companies making EV vehicles? So if you're just looking at their loan exposure to oil and gas industries, could you be exaggerating perhaps the risk because they're lending to other industries? Anyway, I just think it's really interesting. Congratulations. Many potential applications. I'm sure people interested in divestment would be interested in this work as well.
Thank you very much for your question and comments. So yeah, what we have in our mind is exactly like you just said. So there are papers documenting that fossil fuel reserves should remain unused to meet the Paris Agreement. So that's why we thought the stranded asset portfolio reflects that. So our stranded asset portfolio-based scenario is more like fossil fuel reserves becoming stranded over a longer time period. And our market-based methodology actually does not rule out the part that banks might be actually shifting their portfolio from brown to green, because it's based on the overall stock return, which reflects the market expectation of what banks are doing. And so our beta measure can indeed reflect the bank's portfolio to brown loans as well as green loans. But in the analysis that we show with the Y14 data, we might find that the green portfolio allocation also matters to the climate beta, but so far what we've found is that the brown portfolio loan exposure explains the climate beta. So it's more like, it's not saying that the banks' overall portfolio, I agree that banks' overall portfolio should be considered. And we think if we believe that markets are doing that, then the climate beta should be reflecting overall portfolio rather than just the fossil fuel portfolios. But the point that we wanted to make is that it is positively related to the fossil fuel loan, which suggests that there's a loan deterioration channel mechanism going on. Yes.
Is it on? Yeah, there it is. Okay, so when the bank's portfolio allocation across risks, so they're dividing where they're exposed as a way to manage the balance sheet. So when you're looking, when you look through that prism, first, did you look through that prism that banks just have a natural predilection for balance sheet management across their portfolios for where they're going to be exposed anyway? They don't want to be overexposed anywhere. And then the other question is, did you look at the effect of as they look at that portfolio and they look at how to reallocate risk through that portfolio, doesn't matter what it is, the landscape that they look out on would be the kind of the general stop and start support of mineral fossil extraction industries generally. Was that something that affected any of this? And those are, I guess, my two questions.
So to your first question, the data sources, we've used the publicly available data, the stock return and the main balance sheet, bank's balance sheet data for estimating climate beta and C risk. And for the loan portfolio data, we use the Y14, and those are the only sources of this paper. And could you please clarify your second question?
Well, just in the when you look at the landscape of mineral extraction, it's one of the things mineral extractors or fossil fuel dependent oil explorers. They are constantly, the uncertainty in the investment capital flows is based on the stop and start nature of the support for it. The government's against it, the government's for it. My dollars won't move that way if the government's against it. I'm gonna go find something else to do with my money. Was that something, I mean, investors disappear when they think that there's jeopardy in those dollars because the landscape has changed. Was there a way to look at that in terms of that deterioration and those deltas in regular capital and brown capital?
That's a great question, and we haven't thought about it. But it's a great suggestion. We will think about it. Thank you.
I guess I have one question. So in the political economy literature, there's a lot about how firms lobby for their own political interests.
Right.
And I know it's your own opinion, not your employers. But I'm just wondering about if there's a way to account for that here. So you talk about transition-related risks, which includes environmental policy or climate policy changing such that companies that have a lot of exposure to brown loans would be at a bigger risk. So if they spend a lot more on lobbying or advocacy, do you see that in your research, or is there a way to account for that in your study?
Thank you for your question. It's definitely an interesting one. We are heavily relying on market pricing and market values. So we think if those components are already priced in the market, then we are actually reflecting those as well. But it is an assumption that markets are pricing climate risk, including those components. Thank you.
Yes, Joao.
I wonder if you can put back one slide where you have the time series of the PDs. It has a red line. That one. So you focus on that period where the line is going up, right? And to align up with your measure of risk going up. But how do you interpret subsequent period where it comes down abruptly?
That's a great question. We are literally thinking about that. And we also realize that we don't necessarily need to focus on that particular 2 quarters because the spread has been widening up. So we are thinking about why for the previous period as well as the later period.
But I thought your interpretation was that it was this ramp up in the risk here that somehow was associated with an increase in transition risk that then was linking. But something else was also happening that was coming it down, that therefore we should also see the other one coming down, right?
Yeah.
It's not just truncating the sample and say, okay, we don't care about this one.
Of course. Of course.
Thank you. Really interesting work. My question's about responsive actions by banks to this risk, and if there's a way, similar to the approach you're doing, to see if the relationship weakens after a period of volatility in the likelihood of stranded assets, and just to see if there's evidence consistent with them moving out of these or not making new loans to reduce their exposure after a period of volatility.
That's a great question, and we were wondering about the same question. And we, based on our analysis, we did not find banks moving out from the fossil fuel loans so far. But we don't have and actually their brown loan exposure went up during 2020, even starting from 2018. And we don't know why, but that helps explaining the climate beta variation. So the bottom line is that we did not find evidence that banks are moving out from the fossil fuel funding.
I think there is a question there.
Hi. Financial markets and stock markets sometimes or often don't get it right. If we look back to the 2000s and the financial crisis, for a long time the market got it wrong, and then suddenly maybe kind of sort of got it right. Are there ways to do this sort of analysis and to try to answer some of the questions you're trying to answer without using stock prices and financial markets? So perhaps looking at fundamentals of the banks and other data that's available, and assuming that the stock market sometimes gets it wrong and doesn't correctly price risks?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are pros and cons of using market data versus the more fundamental data. And we, of course, using market financial data, the benefit of it is we can incorporate the market expectations, but that could be considered as a limitation at the same time because of the reason that you just mentioned. So we are hoping that this is a complementary methodology to other testing methodologies based on more fundamental type of data.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, over there.
Paper, nice methodology, but to follow up on Joao's question and thinking about this as a macroeconomist, so your risk measure is going to be a function in equilibrium of demand and supply. So I was thinking of the commodity price cycle and how this is correlated with your graph. So for example, why is there a drop in your index for the brown industries during certain periods versus rises, it's just going to follow through, of course, the portfolio. And more recently, we saw energy prices at first going down because you're thinking you're entering a great recession, another great recession, and coming back up. So this is more about interpretation in general, how to kind of pull out the business cycle frequency and the idiosyncratic business cycle, or the part that's differential compared to your overall market risk. So just thinking more about kind of a long-term trend of how portfolios will change versus just the cyclical nature, and having a plot of commodity prices next to this would be actually kind of useful to think about it to start.
Yeah, that's what we are working on, and yeah, because we are using the stranded asset portfolio return as a factor, and it is by construction affected by energy prices in general. And that's why we thought brown minus green factor could be a better one, in a sense that it controls for the overall energy prices. And as I mentioned earlier, we are trying to understand this plot better in the context of your comment. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Titus Pierce, the president of Royal Bank of America. I'm the largest financial institution on the planet, and I have a question for the US government. They're putting in a grandfather at 2030, which is going to actually strand more assets. If you would notice, where I'm concerned is on the climate, they're putting a 2030 climate backstop, right? But of the G20 economies, there's 228 countries in the world, only 20 of them are industrialized. So all of these loans, the brown loans, are tied to energy, which are tied to the largest sophisticated economies, but the entire world is banking with us and is trying to emerge and trying to becoming an emerging economy. Couldn't this 2030 backstop, hemorrhage this a little bit in terms of the top banks?
Thank you for your question. And, it's a very interesting question. I don't have an answer. We will think more about that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you very much.
So now I invite Dr. Jose Luis Cruz.
Sir. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for the invitation to this seminar. I'm super excited of being here. I'm Jose Luis Cruz, and I'm also very happy that I'm going to be joining the New York Fed the next year, so an additional reason to be happy. So thanks so much. And having said that, let me start with my presentation. So global warming is one of the greatest challenges that humankind is going to face in the upcoming decades and centuries. And this phenomenon is mainly originated when economic activity uses fossil fuels that release CO2 emissions to the atmosphere, where they tend to accumulate, increasing the temperatures of the world. But these increases in temperature are expected to have heterogeneous effects depending on different characteristics of the markets. And one reason why these changes in productivity might differ across different markets is first on geographic locations. We may expect that increases in temperature in some of the hottest locations of the world, like sub-Saharan Africa or India, might be particularly damaging to these places, whereas the opposite might happen in the coldest locations of the world, like north of Canada or Siberia. As these places become more temperate, there might be opportunities to improve productivity. But if we were only to look at this level or at this dimension of heterogeneity, we may think that places like Algeria and Australia that have similar levels of temperature might experience similar levels of warming impacts. But this conclusion is misleading when we observe the industrial composition of these countries. In this plot, I am showing the share of employment for these two countries, and we observe that Algeria, an African country mostly devoted to agricultural activities, that have a clear linkage to environmental conditions, whereas Australia is a developed country mostly devoted to services for instance, financial services, and these activities tend to be less climate exposed as they tend to be performed indoors and therefore less susceptible to react to changes in temperature. So the main question of this paper is to understand how these changes across different locations and across different sectors is going to shape the labor reallocation across different workers as a consequence of global warming. And to understand this question, it is essential to understand two things. First, what are the incentives for households to move across different markets, in the sense of which markets are going to be more affected or which markets might be benefited from this phenomenon? But also, it is essential to understand how costly it is for households to move in order to have a proper sense of the labor reallocation across different markets. Regarding the first point about how workers are going to face different incentives, we need to consider the changes in both the production patterns and the consumption patterns. From the production patterns, we might think that productivity in the hottest locations of the world might be one of the markets most exposed to increases in temperature, and therefore there might be further declines in productivity in this sector, reducing the production and therefore the demand for labor in this market. But in addition, there might be additional effects like changes in consumption patterns. When temperatures increase and make the world purer on average, there is expected to be a change in the consumption patterns towards the subsistence good, that is towards the agricultural good, rising the demand for labor in this sector. In this sense, there are two forces determining the final effect of employment in agriculture as a consequence of global warming, the ones coming from the production and those from the consumption patterns. And in order to properly measure these forces, we need a quantitative model at a fine level of resolution that properly accounts for how costly it is for households to move across different markets. And having said that, let me provide you a quick overview and some of the main results of the paper. So first, I construct a dynamic, multi-region, multi-sector economic model of global warming that has different labor markets, and these labor markets might have differentiated exposure in terms of how increases on temperature might affect their productivities. Some of the key ingredients of the model are the presence of these heterogeneous warming impacts on productivity, the non-homothetic preferences, and by that I mean that increases in income might change the composition of consumption away from agricultural goods. And in order to recognize that households and firms might adapt to this phenomenon, I incorporate the costly ability of them to move across different locations and to trade across different regions. After building this model, I pursue to quantify it at a fine level of geographical and sectoral resolution in order to account for the large spatial heterogeneity that exists in the world. The two most novel parts of the quantification of this model rely on to estimate the cost of moving across different locations and across different markets. And it is essential to understand how costly it is for households to move. But most of the literature has ignored this fact by assuming extreme migration frictions, either that households can freely move or that they cannot do so. And the reason for why the literature has done so, because it is difficult to find reliable estimates on migration flows across different markets. That is one of the main contributions of my work, exploring some of the demographic techniques in order to exploit data on census and population surveys to construct migration flows that allow me to infer the migration cost of moving across different markets. The second part of the quantification relates to understand the differentiated effects of increases in temperature in terms of productivity. And by productivity, I not only consider agriculture, but I'm interested in understanding the effects across the other sectors in the economy, and doing so at a worldwide level in order to understand what happens not only in the developed countries, but also in the developing countries. After the quantification, the simulation of the model suggests that on aggregate, employment in agriculture is expected to rise when employment increases, suggesting that the forces of consumption patterns are going to dominate those of the production patterns. But more interestingly, I observe an heterogeneity in terms of the balance of these forces, so that the poorest locations of the world are expected to face the largest increases in employment in agriculture, in one of the most climate-sensitive sectors. And finally, to assess the relevance of the migration cost of serving the world, I perform a counterfactual exercise in which I preclude migration across different markets. And I observe an increase in the average welfare loss, but also a larger spatial dispersion, suggesting that the places that would be more affected by global warming would experience even larger welfare losses when precluding for migration. To quickly relate my work to the current literature, this work relates to the literature on climate migrants that has used some empirical estimates at small levels of geographical resolution that preclude a global analysis of this phenomenon. And some other branch of the climate migrants literature has used economic models, considering extreme migration frictions, and therefore not being able to provide an accurate description of this process. In addition, I'm contributing to the literature that estimates the effects of productivity when temperatures increase, not considering only agriculture, but understanding the effects across different sectors, and not only for developed countries, but also for the rest of the world, for which we might know little. And in this sense, I exploit some of the recent developments in spatial dynamic economic models that allow to incorporate a high level of spatial and industrial resolution, accounting for a large number of adaptation mechanisms, and extend them to incorporate an energy and climate model. And in this sense, my work is contributed to a recent literature on the spatial economic models of global warming. Some previous work that I've conducted is mainly focused in a one-sector economy, mostly interested in understanding the dynamic effects of the economy. But in order to understand labor switching, it is essential to understand that households might also move to different industries as an adaptation mechanism. Some work has been done in this area, but either they tend to consider a coarse aggregation at the spatial level, and they tend to assume extreme migration frictions. So now let me provide you a very intuitive description of the economy, and by that, I'm not going to present you the equations, just going to intuitively describe the workings of the model. If you are interested in the equations, we can talk a little bit more about it at the end of the presentation. So, as I mentioned, the economy is going to be composed by several sectors and regions, and in each market, there's going to be a continuum of workers that are going to provide labor inelastically to the firms. They are going to receive wages in turn, and they can consume, according to the wage received, goods from different sectors, like agricultural goods or financial goods. And that composition of goods across different industries is going to depend on the level of wage that they receive, so that when wages increases, they might shift the consumption away from agricultural goods towards services goods. And in addition, households are going to face a forward-looking, costly mobility decision in terms of where to work and reside in the next period. That is going to depend on the level of consumption in each market and also on the amenities of different locations. And that constitutes the problem of the household. Related to the firm is going to produce goods that are going to be subject to costly international trade. And firms are going to produce goods using labor, land, energy, and materials from different sectors. And the energy good is going to come from two sources: clean energy and fossil fuels. And the main difference for these two types of energy sources is that fossil fuels are going to release CO2 emissions to the atmosphere, where they are going to accumulate, warming up the planet. There is a climate model behind this diagram. And then the increase in local temperatures that might be different depending on the geographical location. Some places might warm faster than others. Is going to affect the productivity across different geographical locations and across different sectors, in the sense that different firms might receive different effects on productivity when temperatures rise. So having set up the framework of the model, let me talk a little bit about the estimation of it. And as I mentioned, one of the main goals of this paper is to provide a fine level of geographical resolution and also a fine level of industrial resolution. By that, I consider 6 economic sectors, namely agriculture, industry, construction, trade and transportation, finance, and other government services. And also I consider roughly 300 regions, and by regions I mean some country-level units, but given that some of the largest countries of the world might be very heterogeneous in terms of the level of temperature that they have, and also in terms of the sectoral composition that they have, I also disaggregate the largest countries of the world, and more precisely I mean United States, Canada, China, India, Brazil, and Russia, at the subnational level. That is, for the United States, it is a state. And with this level of resolution, in order to take the model to the data, I need to construct the patterns of different variables, like consumption, production, employment, energy, and trade patterns coming from international and domestic sources. This process is data-intensive, but I don't want to provide all the details of the quantification in this part. And in turn, let me tell you 3 parts of the quantification that are the most important in the model. And I want to focus more precisely on the estimation of the preferences by the households, how they are going to change consumption when income rises, about the migration costs, how do households migrate in the data, and how can we construct this data, and finally, on how productivity is going to be affected depending on the industrial sector and also depending on the geographical location. Having said that, let me talk a little bit about the preference parameters. And for that, I'm considering some non-homothetic preferences in the sense that the consumption shares might vary according not only to prices, but might vary depending on the level of real income. I am following the strategy of Cumming and co-authors. The variable in the left-hand side relates to the ratio of consumption shares across 2 different goods. The first term in the right-hand side is a fixed effect. The next term relates to the prices of consuming different goods. And the last term relates to the real consumption by households, or the real income, if you will. So the parameters of interest in this part are bar sigma, that is the elasticity of substitution, how easy it is for households to substitute between different goods, and bar theta, that is the good-specific income elasticity, that is, if we increase income, how is the consumption share of different goods going to respond? Let me show you this table. In the first row, I have the elasticity of substitution, which is low, suggesting that goods tend to be complement. In other words, when the price of agriculture rises, households are hindered to substitute away from the good that is getting relatively more expensive. In the next rows, I provide the income elasticity of different goods related to the industry sector, and we observe that the income elasticity for agriculture is negative. That is, increases in income are expected to reduce the consumption share in agriculture. For construction, trade, and transportation, the income elasticity is positive, but small. And in finance and other services, it is way larger, suggesting that when income increases, there is expected to be an increase in the consumption share of these goods. The second part to understand how households are going to migrate is to obtain data of how they actually do that in the data that can be used to infer how costly it is for households to move. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, it is very difficult to find reliable data on international migration. First, because not all countries report this information. It is costly for countries to have these systems. And also, for the countries that do so, they tend to have different definitions of what is a migrant, and therefore it is difficult to compare this information. To circumvent this limitation, I resort to the demographic literature that provides a technique in terms of how to construct these migration flows, the movement of households across different markets, given information on censuses and population surveys. So I do that. I construct information from censuses and population services that allow me to know how many persons are in different locations of the world according to the place of birth. And given this information, I know how many persons are at the beginning, at the end of each location, that is the marginal totals of a migration matrix. And these demographic techniques allows me to construct the entries of the migration matrix. The results of this estimation at the aggregate level are shown in this table, in these graphs. I present the labor mobility at the global level. The line in orange shows the share of workers that are moving to a different sector while staying in the same region. That goes from 12 to 13%. The line in black, the share of workers moving to a different location in the same industry, and the line in red, movements along these two dimensions. We tend to observe much more mobility across different industries relative to across different locations, suggesting the relevance of taking into account the industry switching decision by households. And in this sense, to understand how households move across different industries, we observe that most of them stay in the same industry, but the ones who move, for instance, for agriculture, tends to do it to the trade and transportation sector, and very few of them to the finance sector, showing how different skills requirements are necessary to perform these different activities. In the next part of the quantification, I want to understand how increases in temperature are going to affect productivity across different industries and across different locations. And for that, I need to define, or I need to construct data and productivity, and simply I define it as the real value added in terms of the inputs of production required, that is labor, capital, and energy, and I control for the domestic absorption ratio in order to control for the additional productivity benefit of exporting to different places. And in order to have a panel as long as possible at a worldwide level, I take information from a variety of sources on real value added, employment, and the data from climate is taken from Matsura and Bilmot, which provide information at a 1 degree by 1 degree level of resolution, and I aggregated at the required level of resolution using population weights. I consider that productivity is going to be affected by temperature and precipitation according to the function F, and I also consider a battery of fixed effects that allow me to control for some invariant characteristics, like distance to the seam, elevation, for some time-varying fixed effects that might control for technological changes or shocks to price of commodities, some time trends that might control for slow-moving processes, like changes in economic policies, and more precisely, I consider that temperature and precipitation affect in a non-linear way productivities of the firms, more precisely through this additive separable quadratic specification. And before showing the results of this estimation, let me define the marginal effect of temperature on productivity. That is, the percentage change in productivity when temperature rises by 1 Celsius. This function depends on each industry that is indexed by J, but also might change depending on the geographical location according to the level of temperature they face. The results of the empirical exercise suggest that agriculture and construction are the most climate-sensitive sectors, followed by trade and transportation, and finance and other government services do not display significant results when temperatures increase, as most of these activities tend to be performed indoors, in buildings, and therefore less climate exposed. Temperature tends to show much higher effects, like 1 or 2 orders of magnitude relative to those of precipitation, so I'm going to focus on those of temperature. In order to interpret these results, let me plot the marginal damage function on agriculture. That is this linear function that I showed you a couple of slides before. That is, in the horizontal axis, I have the level of temperature in the initial period, the year 2015, and in the vertical axis, I measure the percentage change in productivity when local temperature rises 1 Celsius. As we can observe, if we are in one of the coldest locations of the world, like Mongolia, an increase of temperature of 1 Celsius is expected to be beneficial in terms of productivity in the agricultural sector by around 3%. But these beneficial effects vanish when we move to warmer locations, eventually turn 0 around 10, 11 Celsius, and turn negative when we move to warmer locations of the world. So that in some of the hottest locations of the world, like sub-Saharan Africa, an increase of local temperature of 1 Celsius is expected to reduce productivity in agriculture by roughly 6%. This level of heterogeneity is not only present for a given industry across different locations, but also for a given location across different industries, we observe some different responses. In the left-hand side, I have the plot for a very cold place, this one for a very hot place. We observe that increases in temperature tend to be beneficial for cold places, particularly in agriculture and construction, whereas the opposite happens in the very hot places. Having said that, with the quantification of the model in hand, I can run the model and perform some exercises to understand what are the welfare effects and how households are going to relocate across different markets. For that, first I'm interested in understanding what are going to be the welfare consequences of global warming when considering these effects on productivity. To evaluate the welfare losses, I consider a version of the world in which productivity is affected, as previously described, and a counterfactual economy in which productivity is not affected by increases of temperature. My measure of welfare considers the willingness to pay of households in terms to avoid the damages originated by this phenomenon. In this sense, values higher than 0, depicted in yellow and orange, show welfare losses, and the opposite holds for negative values in cyan and blue. We tend to observe that the largest losses are concentrated in the hottest locations of the world, whereas some cold places might experience some welfare gains. But there is some heterogeneity in terms of how different locations might be affected by increases of temperature. We observe a large dispersion in terms of Africa, for instance, where sub-Saharan Africa, that is hotter relative to the rest of the continent, is expected to face larger welfare losses. And this heterogeneity is also present within country. For instance, in India, we tend to observe most of the damages in the northern part of the country, where most of the agricultural activities perform. In China, for instance, we tend to see some beneficial effects in the northern part of the country, as it is a relatively cold location. But in the central part, we tend to see some differentiated effects. The coast is going to be less affected relative to mainland China. And that is explained because the coast is an economy mostly devoted to services, whereas mainland China is mostly devoted to agricultural activities. In the United States, we see that most of the variation is given not by the agricultural sector, because it represents a small fraction of employment, but mostly given by the trade and transportation sector. And given these heterogeneous effects of temperature across different markets, that might create incentives for households to move across different industries. That is what I plot in this diagram. In this plot, I show the difference of a world with global warming relative to a world without global warming in the year 2200. We tend to observe at the aggregate level that there is an increase in the employment in the agricultural sector and a decline in those other sectors. That is, remember these two forces, one force of the production patterns, that is, agriculture is relatively less productive, so we want to produce less, but there is an additional force. The world is getting purer on average as a consequence of global warming, and we change our consumption patterns towards agriculture, requiring more of this good. This final effect is dominating on aggregate, explaining the increase in the agricultural sector. But more interestingly, the balance of these forces varies depending on the geographical location. We tend to see that employment in agriculture tends to be larger in some of the hottest locations of the world, like Africa, India, and some parts of China. Given these different incentives for households to move across different locations, that might also create differences in terms of welfare losses. We observe that the agricultural sector, the workers in the agricultural sector, are going to face the largest welfare losses, around 3% in terms of consumption terms, followed by industry, construction, and trade and transportation. And interestingly, at the worldwide average, workers in finance and government and other services are going to experience welfare benefits from this phenomenon. And why? Because most of these workers are allocated in the developed part of the world that tends to be relatively cold. So increases of temperature tend to be beneficial in terms of the wage they obtain, and also because that allows them to have access to cheaper consumption goods. Finally, I perform a counterfactual exercise in which I want to understand how the previous results would change when precluding the possibility of migration. In this plot, I show the welfare losses with no migration relative to the welfare losses in the baseline scenario. That is, positive values suggest that these countries are worse off or are more affected when we preclude migration across different markets. The warmest places in the world, for instance in Africa, tend to be worse off when precluding migration. And why? Because first, they cannot move to locations that might be more beneficial, but also, since they cannot move, these places are going to be more populated, congesting production, reducing production per capita, and therefore the wage they receive. But in addition, by having a lower level of income, they might change their consumption patterns. So they decide to consume more of the agricultural good, which is relatively more expensive, adding an additional downward pressure to the welfare of these workers. And finally, let me conclude my presentation. And just let me recall what we have been discussing. So the goal of this paper is to understand how different workers are going to allocate across different markets, meaning different locations and economic sectors. And for that, we need to take into account the incentives to move and the cost of doing so. This is a quantitative question which requires to develop a model. And for that, I consider some of the recent developments of spatial dynamic economic models that allow a fine level of resolution and a large number of adaptation mechanisms. I allow for trade of goods, mobility of workers, and changes in consumption patterns, and also for differences in the exposure that changes in temperature might have on the productivity across different markets. In terms of the quantification of the model, I pursue a fine level of resolution, and the two most novel parts of the quantification are the construction of worldwide market-level bilateral migration patterns, and also the estimation of the responses of productivity when temperatures rises, in which agriculture and construction are the most climate-sensitive sectors. The simulation of the model suggests that more of employment is going to be relatively allocated to agriculture when temperatures rise, and that precluding migration across different locations might exacerbate on aggregate the welfare effects for this phenomenon, and more interestingly, is going to be more damaging for the poorest persons of the world, the ones living in the developing, poor, and hot parts of the world. In this sense, this model can be used as a workhorse model to analyze different aspects, like the effect of different immigration or commercial policies, to analyze what is the optimal environmental policy, the optimal allocation of households across different markets. In this paper, I'm just studying the reallocation of labor, but we could also be interested in the reallocation of investment and the effects of increases in temperature on physical capital. And also this model could be extended to study not only global warming, but also different climate phenomena. And having said that, let me thank you for your attention and for the invitation.
Great stuff. Thank you so much, Jose Luis. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
So I was having a little trouble keeping up, so that was pretty fast. So if my questions are off, just tell me. There were two aspects that were running through my mind the whole time you were speaking with respect to sort of agricultural macro trends. Did you consider, as temperature warms, the possibility of robotics and automation displacing the actual labor that was going to benefit from the climate change effects? And then the second one was urbanization. So just two sort of normal trends that were going to affect agricultural labor. I didn't really see where those were being applied in your thesis. So
yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and for now I'm considering that productivity has two components: an exogenous component that replicates the evolution of value added per worker in the last 25 years, and an endogenous component that reacts to changes in temperature So in this sense, I'm mostly interested in the relative effects of temperature on the relocation of workers. But as you pointed out, there might be additional effects or endogenous effects on productivity. For instance, if workers tend to move to the coldest locations of the world as temperatures increase, the higher agglomeration of workers might create incentives for firms to innovate and to further boost productivity. So these kind of effects in which I allow, or we could think about endogenous increases of productivity, I have studied them in a different paper, in the Economic Geography of Global Warming, in which we are mostly interested in understanding the growth rate of the economy, how this is going to evolve over time, how this might be different across different locations, and how it might differ when temperatures increase. So in this paper, I am mostly interested on the relative effect of temperature on the allocation of labor. But in different work, I have studied how the growth rate of the economy might change in an endogenous way when temperatures increase, and might affect different ways in which people work in terms of productivities. It might also change the quality of life and have different incentives for households to move. So I have studied a little bit of that regard of how productivity might endogenously respond.
Is about the variables in consideration, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that your research with regards to the levels of household migration or brain drain, depending on who you ask, is heavily dependent on the supply of labor from households. So I was wondering, does it hold that the demand for labor from the production or industry side is constant?
A very good question. I mean, in this model, I'm considering that households inelastically supply labor. So in this sense, they don't have this utility effect when temperatures rise, particularly in the hottest locations of the world. But as you suggested, I mean, as temperatures increase, places in sub-Saharan Africa might become even hotter, and therefore workers might have a higher disutility for working in those places. And in the contrast, as some cold places might be more temperate and less cold, there might be higher utility for households to work there. So this effect on amenity that might capture some labor responses of workers, I have also analyzed it in a different paper in which I study not only the effects in terms of productivities, but also the effects in terms of these amenities that might make some places more suitable to work and live. And in this sense, I might be capturing the changes in the labor supply that might be endogenously responding to which places are becoming more suitable for living and producing according to the changes in temperature.
Yes.
Okay, very interesting paper. Just a quick question, which is, what assumptions did you make about changes in diet? Did you assume that people's diet would be relatively continuous? Because I know that there are organizations now, including from the IPCC and various NGOs, trying to encourage changes in diet so that there's less consumption of meat and dairy products because they're higher in GHG emissions. And so I'm wondering how, if there were changes in diets over time, not only because incomes are rising, but because they're changing preferences, how would that affect, the switch that you're projecting towards more agricultural employment?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm considering changes in diets or changes in consumption patterns at the level of resolution of these 6 economic sectors. Okay, so at this level of resolution, I allow for changes in the consumption patterns. I mean, probably you might be thinking about changes within food or changes within the agricultural sector. So, I mean, having data within the agricultural sector for the whole world is kind of difficult, so probably I might require a little bit more work in terms of the data to be able to disentangle more or to have a better level of resolution in terms of the agricultural sector, to have a higher definition of how different diets might change due to the effects of temperature. For the moment, I'm considering changes in the composition of consumption at this level of resolution, but the model allows for having a finer level of resolution, so that could be done upon the availability of data.
All right, just checking to see if there are other people who had questions. Thank you for presenting on this paper. I resonate with that that feeling that I think I was just trying to keep up a little bit because I'm very new to a lot of this, and you have a lot of amazing information here to share. But something that was kind of running through my head throughout the presentation was this idea of productivity. And I understand, as far as I can understand right now, like that it's based in a lot of ideas of like the economic sense, the human economic sense of productivity and labor, as in human laborers. And one of the key things that I took away that you mentioned at the end again reiterated was that the labor reallocation would trend towards agriculture as temperature rises. But in my reading and what I understand on the ecological side of things, when temperature rises, there is a huge change in what ecosystem services are going to be available to humans. Temperature rising might mean a more temperate climate in the north and cold, what is now colder regions, but it also may result in like ecological disaster that makes those places uninhabitable or less able to produce agriculturally in the ways, even if we wanted to adapt them to be more like the places that are now temperate, that might incur even more kind of loss on the ecological side of things. So I'm just kind of wondering overall where ecosystem services and the changes in them over time might be factoring into like the productivity side of this, and how this paper might, like what implications it holds for how we would be thinking about people moving and what we want to happen to the earth and where people are going and why.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So probably you might be thinking that these effects on productivity might change depending on whether the country is rich or poor, in the sense that richer countries might have better adaptation mechanisms, better health services, better air conditioner, whereas poor countries might not be able to have this infrastructure, and therefore they might be more climate sensitive. So in order to test that specification, I mean, I performed some robustness exercises in the sense that I analyzed the effect of temperature, but also interacted with the level of income to see if there is a sense in which the effect of temperature depends on whether the country is poor or richer. And at this level of resolution, I don't find a significant relationship. And that could be explained because given the increases of temperature up to this moment have been not that large, I mean, probably we might be observing like relatively few adaptation responses, but also in order to circumvent this limitation of the empirical identification that might not be capturing all the adaptation responses, that is the main reason why I construct a model that accounts for some of the most salient adaptation mechanisms, like trade of goods and mobility of persons across different markets. And that could be also an additional way in which households might adapt to this phenomenon. You might be thinking that some places, like the poorest places of the world, might be particularly or might be even more affected when there is a lack of public services in which they could live. So some of the responses of these households could be incorporated in this model in terms of they might decide to move to a different place or import goods from places that might be more affected. And that is one of the main reasons why I put together a model that allows me for these endogenous responses of households to try to account for these adaptation responses that they might endogenously have.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Wolfram.
I think his main takeaway was that the big difference is whether you change openness to trade or not, and whether the agriculture reallocates from developing to developed countries. So how do you exactly model sort of changes in openness to trade and trade restrictions in your model?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I could analyze these different effects of changes in trade component. I mean, for instance, if we were to open up the economy and reduce all the barriers to trade, then we would expect that on average the world might be better off, as the places that might be the hardest could import the goods from the places that are less affected or even benefited from this phenomenon. I think that there has been some analysis in this sense, like Costino and co-authors have explored this venue, but I think that much less work has been done in terms of understanding the changes in the migration cost. And in that sense, we may think that this liberalization of trade costs could be further benefited by also lowering the migration cost, in the sense that if we were to reduce migration costs, then some of the households could move to the places that are getting relatively benefited by this phenomenon, even though some persons might still be living in the hottest locations of the world, by further reducing these trade costs, they may experience a benefit, as they might be buying cheaper goods from places that might be less affected. So I think that I'm mostly interested in this venue of understanding the role of the migration cost, as some of this work has been done in terms of studying the effect or the changes in trade patterns or in trade costs in the reallocation of production and employment. But I could also encompass these effects and particularly understand what would be the interaction between, or what would be the complementarity or substitutability between types of policies that change the commercial or the immigration patterns.
Sorry, can I follow up there? So Nat gives this estimate of what trade restriction relaxation would imply on welfare improvement. How does it imply compare to your implication of relaxing migration restrictions? So basically, is it better to move the goods or is it better to move the people?
That is a question that I can solve within the model. I can do that. I could follow up in some days or weeks with a better answer for that. Because that is a quantitative question. There might be interaction between the effects of liberalizing trade or liberalizing migration. So, probably I would suspect that liberalizing migration might be more beneficial. Probably that might be a more direct way to improve the welfare of households, but probably, that's a quantitative question that I need to answer within the model, within the lens of the model. I can do that. So I will let you know in the near future about it.
And sort of following up on that, so Wolfram raised about moving the workers or moving the goods. I'm curious about outsourcing, so I guess moving the work. So is your model able to account for jobs moving to other countries, or are you able to see that in the data that you have from the countries you study? Because we could imagine that, there could be more outsourcing specifically to regions like South and Southeast Asia, like there is now, for indoor jobs like the finance sector. And we could potentially see that as kind of ameliorating the bad impacts of global warming. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
That's a great point about outsourcing. And in some sense, we could be thinking about how labor might move across different, for a given industry across different markets. So in some sense, the data that I obtain, is based on censuses or population surveys. So they just ask you, in which sector are you working, regardless of whether, regardless of the source of the work, whether it is outsourced or insourced or has a different component. So in some sense, I would be capturing this effect. But that is a very interesting avenue. I need to think more about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we'll hear from Professor Harrison Hong on mitigating disaster risks in the age of climate change, and we have until 5 p.m.
Great. Thanks, Tariqa. Let me thank my colleagues Doug and Wolfram for organizing this conference. It's great, and also Joao Santos of the New York Fed. It's great that the New York Fed is getting engaged on these sustainability issues and also sort of opening up the conference to all of our fellow citizens in New York. So this is joint with Neng Wang at Columbia and Jin Chang Yang, based out of Shanghai. He's currently been locked down for 2 months, but it's been very nice co-author and still nonetheless helped me prepare for this presentation. I'm going to pick up on the set of nice talks this morning on flooding and insurance. And in particular, I'm also going to pick up on the keynote speech that Ben Harris gave about exactly that in the age of climate change, one of the ways that we're feeling these effects is vis-a-vis these disasters. And so we'll talk about kind of what is, how we should think about dealing with these disasters from here. I'm going to come at it from a much more kind of financial economics perspective. So, according to the National Academy of Sciences, climate change is likely to make weather disasters more severe. Examples include increased frequency and severity of these tropical cyclones, extreme heat and wildfires. And, decarbonization at the global level, which has really been the focus of climate economics and also kind of climate policy, even if it's successful, which it doesn't look like amazingly successful currently, may not help us for decades, right? So that regional level disaster mitigation, or is oftentimes called adaptation, is likely to have to play a major role going forward in tandem with our efforts to address decarbonization at the global level. Okay? So what we do in the paper is to kind of analyze this regional level mitigation problem, to do a welfare analysis of this regional level mitigation problem using a stochastic growth model. And the model is going to have some familiar features for all of you, but also some unfamiliar features. So kind of the key aspects of the model are that we're going to have a technology, some type of ex-ante mitigation spending, right? That's going to reduce the damage to capital conditioned on the disaster, on the arrival of a disaster, okay? And the arrivals of disasters, so these could be tropical cyclones or heat waves, are going to change our perceived risk of the impact of a hotter Earth as far as the severity of these disasters, okay? And I'm going to emphasize that there's quite a lot of learning that we're going to have to do because climate models have a very wide band in terms of scenarios about sort of the impact on the frequency and the severity of disasters. And these arrivals, which increase our perceived risk, is also going to change our value for this mitigation, okay? The model is also going to feature, realistically, an under-provision of mitigation in competitive markets relative to the planner's solution due to externalities, right? So examples of an under-provision would be, nobody can build their own seawall, right? You got to have some coordination to deal with flooding, right? Everybody individually defending their apartment is not very effective. You really need a more coordinated effort, okay? So that's an externality, potentially. And kind of the main kind of theoretical result that's not obvious in the paper is that the introduction of a tax on capital, so capital is the primary and the only input in our model. So you can think about capital as also housing capital. It could be plants and property and equipment. The introduction of a capital tax equal to the mitigation spending in the planner's solution, introducing competitive markets gets you back to first best. Okay? It's not an obvious result, so we're kind of in a refereeing, and we've been arguing with referees constantly, but I think that we're right. So I'll kind of talk about why that's true. The model is parsimonious. It's meant primarily to help us deal with kind of analytical issues in terms of welfare analysis, but it's rich enough for some quantitative analysis. So I don't want to overemphasize the quantitative part. It's rich enough to match the moments, so it's very much in the style of a macro finance type of paper where we're going to introduce some additional sustainability moments, right? So we can kind of speak to simultaneously macro finance moments like interest rates and risk premia and Tobin's Q and economic growth, and at the same time match it to disaster moments, right? What happens when a tropical cyclone hits a country, right? How much do governments currently spend on defending themselves against natural disasters? Okay? So that's the goal. So let me so the model itself, because the damage is primarily to capital, it's kind of best applied to thinking about cyclones, essentially. So I'll kind of motivate our model using some data from cyclones. Some of this is going to be familiar to those of you in the literature, but I think some of you may not, so I'll kind of go through the data slowly. So tropical cyclones affect nearly 35% of the global population, okay? And in table 1 here, I'm going to show you data that we have from 109 countries that are kind of in the path of a cyclone from 1960 to 2010. And it's split into North Atlantic, West Pacific, North India, South Atlantic, and there's going to be kind of a global number. So column 1, there's been about 5,410 country year observations of these cyclones. 729 have hit landfall, okay? So that's about an arrival rate of about 7.5 once every 7.5 years. A typical country in this global sample gets hit by a tropical cyclone, okay? So what happens when this country gets hit? So this is a set of results that's follows this paper from Shang and Gina. This is kind of the most amazing paper that I think has never been published. This is an NBR working paper on what 6,000 tropical cyclones tell us about. I have no idea why this paper is not published. Anyways, so this is just kind of a replication of that paper. We don't do fancy things like Saul and everybody else because we don't have the manpower. There's just the three of us. So we're going to do like a regular old landfall regression that's in the data. But the numbers are very similar to what the paper finds. So when a cyclone makes landfall in a typical country in our sample, what you'll see is that GDP growth rate of real GDP per capita falls. Okay? If you look at the column 5, it's about 77 basis points. So it's about 1%. Globally, the typical GDP growth rate, it's about 3%, 2 to 3%. It's a pretty big hit, right, for a typical country. This is not the United States of America, okay? So this is like 109 countries. Your typical country, you should think about like the Philippines. Yeah. And, you know, the puzzle is that actually this shortfall lasts not 1 year, right? You might think in the year that it gets hit, your growth rate is lower, right? But it lasts persistently for like a number of years. These countries don't bounce back after a cyclone hits, actually. Okay, so this is a little bit contrary to the comment that Ben Harris has made, right? That, you know, what happens is that you have the cyclone hit, you get a big bump, you get a big rebound in this economic activity. It actually really doesn't happen for a typical country. It sort of happens if you're America and you have COVID and you have a big balance sheet and everybody can get like a nice paycheck, but it doesn't really happen in other countries, right? Because there's not, markets are fairly incomplete, okay? So this paper is really about a typical country, right? That is where most people live, which is 35% of the population, okay? So what do people do around the world? You know, mostly, right, they have a government flood control budget. It's not that easy to get this data. I'd be very curious for people who can get more data. We were able to kind of get 72 country-year observations. So typically, a country has a budget that's, in our sample of the 72 country-year observations, is about 10 basis points of capital stock, which is about 1% of GDP, annual GDP. Okay, so that's sort of like a budget that's meant to have like warning system, a preparation of roads and infrastructure when the storm comes, obviously a lot of sandbags, basically, is kind of the primary. And actually, sandbags are fairly expensive. Private mitigation efforts are obviously even harder to measure, but, you know, I think the estimates from what I've read is that, you know, it's kind of on the order of similar to kind of a public mitigation effort, right? Okay. So what about cyclone projections? Now, we talk as if we know the consequences of global warming for disasters, but actually, if you look at the top 50 models that project out tropical cyclone frequency, and here they look at very intense tropical cyclones, there's a huge dispersion in terms of what these models predict. And these are the 50 leading models, okay? So if you focus on the first panel A, the red, this is a histogram, okay? It's a histogram of these 50 models, and on the x-axis is the percentage change in terms of the frequency of very intense tropical cyclones, right? So this is like a Cat 3 or above, okay? So it's true. The typical, if you kind of look at the histogram, it's about like a 15% is where we should be expecting sort of like a, you know, the typical country is expecting a 15% increase in frequency. So it's going to bring you from 7.5 years to maybe like 6 years, once every 6 years. But, you know, look at the right tail. There is a right tail. And this is kind of, I think, more like the bad state where it goes doubles. So that means the rate doubles. So that means you're basically expecting a major tropical cyclone once every 3.5 years. Okay? Now, if you look on the b-axis, these models have a very hard time when you start basically looking regionally. Okay? Right? So there's a huge amount of dispersion. So you're never going to get a very kind of clear answer if you look across the different regions. Right? And these are whisker plots. But I think the data conveys clearly the following, is that the age of climate change means what? We're going to find out, right, which of these models are right. Yeah. We're kind of living through the age of climate change. Okay? So, of course, we're learning, right? We're kind of learning about these consequences of global warming. So what the model kind of really emphasizes is really a belief updating process, right? So we're going to use a rational Bayesian belief updating process that we're going to kind of calibrate to this type of data, where we're going to think about kind of a good state is kind of the state that we're in, where there's not going to be much of an increase or a change, right? So we're going to stay at like one major hurricane hitting a typical country every 7.5 years. That's like a good state. A bad state would be once every 3.5 years, right? That would be kind of, you know, so this pie, right? So these red dots represent these discrete arrivals of these disasters. The bottom plot, the belief pie, pi t is going to represent our belief about the consequences of this kind of 2°C world. Are we kind of going to land in a good state where, you know, it's going to maybe increase a little bit, but not that bad? Or are we in kind of a bad state? Okay. So the learning process is a very interesting process, right? And which is, it's going to match, I think, the data that people who work on sustainability see, which is when a disaster arrives, support for mitigation goes way up. Everybody's like, God, you know, build me a seawall after Sandy. But then, if a disaster doesn't come, you know, the risks go back down. Oh, we haven't had it yet. Yeah, maybe we don't really need that seawall. Yeah? So that's what we're going to pick up. That's the belief updating process. Now, I mean, I don't think the real world belief updating process is so necessarily kind of Bayesian, but having said that, you know, we do live in, it's not as if natural disasters are not, you know, we've always had natural disasters, right? And so clearly the big difference in the age of climate change is we think that there could be a structural break in the underlying process generating these disasters. Yeah? Okay? And I think the Bayesian model captures some aspects of the updating that seem consistent with the data. So one thing I'll tell you about the belief updating. If you get several disasters coming very quickly on each other with a very small inter-arrival time, people's beliefs really go really fast. So, you know, if you want everyone to start building and buffering the Atlantic, you just need a few major hurricanes, and it's got to come really quickly. They cannot come 7.5 years apart, because that's the updating process, right? If they come frequently, you're just saying to yourself, yeah, I'm in the bad regime. You know, we're not in once every 7.5 years, we're in once every, like, 3 years. Okay? All right, so what are our main findings? You know, there's a bunch of stuff we could do. We calculate the impact, I mean, just sort of as a way to kind of center the model. We're going to calculate the impact of one major cyclone arrival for a typical country in its data. And what the model generates is the following. When a disaster arrives, there's two effects. There's both a direct effect, which is capital gets damaged, but there's also going to be this learning or indirect effect, which is people also learn, they say to themselves, wow, the perceived risk now has gone up. Okay? And in the data that we calibrate, we're calibrating kind of, you know, we're at a 0.1, so this is kind of the weight that you're putting on kind of a really bad state of once every 3.5 years rather than once every 7 years. You know, that's going to jump, right? So it's going to jump kind of, you know, in this kind of Bayesian learning process. The jump is going to depend on a bunch of parameters, which I'll talk about in a second, but it's going to jump from kind of a 0.1 to 0.2. Not a massive jump. You don't jump to 0.5, you jump to 0.2. Okay. And there's going to be, of course, as I emphasized, this gradual reversion in the absence of jumps. You're going to get some increase in taxes to fund some mitigation. Maybe you don't get the really nice seawall, but maybe you get some extra cleaning staff to make sure that, you know, stuff is like unclogged, right? Okay, in terms of the preparation. So we calibrated it to a 10 basis points. So the 10 basis points can be interpreted as a tax in the model, right? Because it's a first best. You can implement first best with a tax. So this is going to be the planner solution as well, right? So taxes in competitive markets yield basically the planner's outcome. So you're going to get a 10 basis point. That goes up to about 12 basis points of capital for the typical country. One interesting result is that, you know, when you get more frequent disasters, it actually is more efficient in the model to do what we call kind of a public mitigation rather than private mitigation. And I'll kind of explain where that comes from. So basically the optimal mix. So in the planner's equilibrium, there's going to be both a private and a public margin, right? And so the way we think about a private is you defend your house. We think about public is you're going to make an investment and everybody in that region benefits from that investment. And that's kind of the distinction. And of course, if you're just getting a lot of this, right, it just becomes more efficient, just everybody basically kind of, you get that kind of everybody defense outcome. We also reconciled the puzzle in the Shang-Jina paper, right? Why are growth rates persistently low after the arrival of a disaster? Well, the learning effect is going to give you that because it's basically saying the world is riskier, right? Conditional on the arrival of a disaster, right? You are basically living in a world with more risk. And there's a higher willingness to pay for mitigation. And you're going to go up from about like 0.17 is a certainty wealth equivalent that you're willing to give up for this technology to kind of a 0.19. The market economy willingness to pay is actually fairly close to the first best economy when the perceived risks are low. In other words, right now, we don't actually, the welfare gains we get at a 0.1 probability of a kind of a bad state, right, in terms of having a public mitigation and taxes and private households doing more mitigation than they should, right, is not that different in kind of an aggregate welfare sense. But once these beliefs increase, right, the welfare gains become substantial, the switching into like a tax coordination equilibrium. Okay? So in the model, the way it works is that if the government's not doing anything, we all have to do extra work, right? You know, I'm going to make sure I buy the extra 10 sandbags to like defend, or I'm going to put my house on the stilt, right? But it doesn't really kind of help my neighbor, and it doesn't really help the entire city of New York. And so final result, which is kind of a little bit surprising, but we could have learned and kind of playing around with the model, which is the change in Tobin's Q, which is essentially, think about Tobin's Q as the price of property or the price of capital or the price of a firm, right? That's kind of equivalent in our model. The change in the Tobin's Q, the risk premium, and the interest rates actually depend a lot on risk preferences. And I think this is related to what Anna was talking about a little bit this morning in terms of this kind of margin and disutility. So, you know, it turns out in this model, it really matters what you think the agent's risk preferences are, right? And some of this kind of harkens back to kind of the old macro finance literature on the equity risk premium. Okay. So, and I know that since there's vodka being served, you're all dying to like practice just stochastic calculus. So I will not deny you the benefit. So I'm going to just intuitively describe the equations. Unfortunately, I'm not as nice as Jose and kind of made nice figures and everything. I'm too old for that. So I will just describe some of the main parts and kind of verbally articulate. I think that, you know, the thing is simple enough that the economics is actually fairly transparent once I articulate what the assumptions are. So first, imagine we're living in a world. The only input that generates output for us is capital. Okay, so you can think about this world as property, and the thing that we get is rental services, right? That's the output. Okay, and A is some productivity parameter. So capital grows in this economy potentially for three reasons. One is, of course, we make investments. That's I. The other is there could be some shocks, right? This is the DW shock. So these are kind of the Brownian motions. This is kind of in continuous time. And these are kind of your normal business as usual shocks. The third piece, which is the piece of interest in this DK equation, is this DJ shock. That's the disaster, right? That's a jump shock. When the jump comes, it's going to destroy a certain fraction of our capital. Okay? So that destruction is going to be captured by this 1 minus z term. And K, this little T minus indicates the capital we had right before the storm arrived, right before Sandy arrived. Now, Z itself is a random variable. What is it? So when a storm hits, actually, there's a distribution of damages, right? It's not as if when a storm hits, all the damages are always the same every time, right? So the way we think about it is a storm hits landfall, and we're going to draw from a distribution of damages. And naturally, the distribution will be very fat-tailed. Most of the time, it's okay, but you're going to get this big, big fat tail, which is what happened with Sandy. N is the exposure that capital has to this jump shock. Okay? So N is a variable that we can control. That's part of our mitigation strategy. So we can kind of reduce our exposure. So the firm, by spending XE, right? So XE is going to be preparedness spending. This is before the jump. If society makes certain investments, it's going to insulate itself from the worst damages associated with that jump and the draw of this Z distribution. Okay? And the way that kind of the model works is we should think about this control as everything is going to scale with capital. Okay? So the way we think about it is that if we spend a certain fraction of our capital on this defense, right, that will basically mitigate the damages associated with the shock. The firm then pays out some output, subtract off investments, subtract off some adjustment costs, and subtract off the cost of mitigation. So what are adjustment costs? This is super crucial. So these capital adjustment costs are exactly what gives rise to the price of capital, right, that fluctuates over time. Because it's costly to build capital, right, and it takes time, existing capital has rents associated with it, okay, and that's the price of capital. And we're going to kind of do the usual assumption that we're going to assume that everything in the economy scales with K, so you can just think about the economics as always just like, scale by K, essentially, right? And we're going to assume that increasing in convex adjustment costs. So it's costly to make very dramatic investments very quickly, right, because of convexity. Otherwise, markets are complete, right? So kind of to Joel's paper earlier, we're going to assume in the background there's actually a perfect insurance market. So this is really about, and of course this is an abstraction, so this I'm just really, really focusing on real investments that society makes to hedge aggregate systemic risks that are non-insurable, right, to the country. Yeah? So here, I am really focusing on, at the regional level, risks that are not insurable. Okay? Firms maximize, sorry about that, there's going to be a missing integral. It's going to maximize the present discounted value of all the cash flows by choosing investment and mitigation, and they're going to take as given the market price of risk, which is given by this M. Okay. Final part. Households have some risk preferences. I'll skip that. This is kind of the most important part. This market price of risk, M, depends on, which all firms take as given, can be influenced by spending on the part of society and government, right, in terms of defending the economy against these aggregate risks that hit that region. Right? So the way we think of this is this would be kind of like buffering infrastructure, right? Seawalls, et cetera, that would essentially benefit everyone living. No one gets excluded from the seawall, right? Okay? And that technology is the thing that reduces the aggregate risk for that region associated with the arrivals of these disasters. Okay? And that's really the source of externality. Why is it a source of externality? Because firms they take the price of risk as given. They don't want to spend to change the price of risk for the economy because in a competitive market, firms take that as given. That's how they discount their cash flows. It's up to government to basically change the price of risk in the economy. Okay? All right, I think my time is kind of running out. I'll just show you some plots. I think you kind of get the basic idea. So this is kind of what the model generates. So the idea is that we're going to have, on the x-axis, pi. This is the pi I was talking about, right? That tells, our perceived risk of how bad, right? Are we going to be in a bad state or a good state when it comes to the consequences of global warming for more frequent disasters? Yeah? So you can see I start off calibrated at that little pink thing, right? So XD, this is the spending in a planner economy. That's the blue line. In a competitive market, nobody spends on a seawall. But in a competitive market, people will really make their house more defendable, right? So they'll spend a lot on individual mitigation, right? Because, there's no seawall, you better get some stilts for your home, basically, right? The extra special stilts, right? Okay? And so notice the solution. In the planner solution, you spend less on individual mitigation because you don't need it, right? You spend more on the infrastructure. So, if the infrastructure is better, you don't have to worry about the individual mitigation as much. You still have some in equilibrium, but you don't need it as much. So when a disaster arrives, you get a jump, right, from that pi 0 minus, that's 0.1, to a 0.027. And then these curves essentially tell you the optimal policies, right? In both a competitive market economy without taxes and in basically the planner's economy, which is the competitive market economy with a capital tax, with a tax, right, on property that funds basically the mitigation. Okay, and I'm going to begin Q&A. That's my sign. Oh, thank you.
Are there any questions? And just so no one loses sleep, I recently saw that the Shang and Gina paper is R&R at the Journal of Political Economy, so it will be published soon.
It'll be published soon.
Yeah.
That's good. It deserves to be published.
So I have one question. I thought this was very interesting. You said here and in the paper that the average one is 7.5 years, and if households see disasters happening every 3.5 years, that's like really disastrous for their perception. And scientists are also predicting that we might see more and more simultaneous disasters like flood and wildfire, things like that. Do you imagine that in your model, households would see that like, oh my God, this is completely impossible. What are the chances we would see these 2 or 3 disasters happening together? Or that it could be kind of the other end of the spectrum, that they would be very, very pessimistic?
No, I think you're right that, so I think we can work out we can work out a model, which is an interesting model, where you have global warming has consequences for different types of disasters, right? And then the observation of the frequency, right, at which these different disasters come, right? You can kind of then, that's an extra signal that you can discriminate, right? So you can imagine like there's a bad world and a good world. Right now, I'm only assuming tropical cyclones are your only like signal, but of course in practice, you can also get the heat waves and everything. And I think for sure that's kind of helped, I think, speed up the learning process, right, of society that, oh, we are probably getting we're probably in a bad world. Now, I have to kind of look at the distribution of these global warming models, but I think they should all be kind of the same. I mean, you have to kind of find like a wildfire model and then kind of line up what you think the different frequencies are, right? And then, of course, by observing multiple signals, you can converge faster, right, to whether you're like bad or good in terms of the consequences of global warming for disasters. Yeah.
Yeah. James?
Interesting talk, an interesting model. I think one of the assumptions is essentially the strength of your prior or sort of your averaging period. And I imagine that, say, the planner is going to have a different averaging period. They're not going to be so quick to update as an individual. 2 things. So, what do you think having some heterogeneity in there would do? And then in the extreme, if you actually had heterogeneity, not just between planners and firms in general, but actually between firms, what would that do?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's, in our model, of course, we the planner and the household are the same. We give them the same learning process. But of course, you could imagine that if you look observationally at the data, certainly in the US, there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of how quickly people are learning about global warming. So you could get some results, obviously, depending on the divergence, right, of where you think the planners' perceived risk are compared to kind of an average household, right? We could solve that in the model, right? You know, if you kind of told us the learning process, right? So maybe you might think that households, you know, could learn maybe slower, maybe they're not, you know, it depends a little bit on your model. I don't have a good prior on the model, but certainly if you give us the learning process for the planner versus the learning process for households in a competitive market, right? We could try to then calculate, of course, right, what the differences in terms of the beliefs are of the planner versus the household for the consequences of kind of comparing basically the planner economy versus the competitive markets. And, you know, and I think that that's potentially kind of an interesting exercise in the context that we do see data that, you know, it seems as if, at least in the US anyways, right, there's a lot more skepticism on these consequences than would be, say, from the Biden administration, right, in terms of what the consequences are, so.
Tax on capital here seems like the adaptation corollary to get them individuals to internalize the externality to the mitigation tax on emissions problem. You mentioned that you're having some issues with the reviewer. So what, I mean, it seems to me like a sort of straightforward corollary of the adaptation world to the mitigation world. What's the sort of angle that they're concerned about here?
Yeah, so I mean, in fairness, you know, you're completely right that obviously this is a Pigouvian tax, but it's not, so the Pigou results are kind of much more limited in certain settings, right? And so we have a pretty rich setting. It's not obvious that some of those results will be true. So there's some assumptions in the underlying model in terms of the technology that make it such that it is true. I mean, of course, there's no doubt that having a tax will help, but whether it gets you to the first best is like a separate kind of animal, right? Does that make sense? So it's really about the argument about the first best. I mean, there's no doubt that having a tax could kind of help bring you potentially more distribution mitigation, right? But it's not obvious that will get you to first best.
Getting you all the way back to first best?
Yeah, we're trying to figure that out. I mean, we have a proof that it's first best, but you know, it's like, you know, it's kind of like these proofs. You know, you're like, there's a proof. I mean, but it's not. Then you're like, if you change some stuff, you have to have another proof, right? There's no, yeah. So.
Last question before drinks, right? So I'm a little bit worried. I think that this tension between mitigation investment versus adaptation investment, very real, and you at least begin to tackle it, but you're using traditional economics and traditional markets. So what I'm worried about here is, you know, all of this incentives using regular markets is too slow with respect to science and our need to actually achieve reductions in the emissions so that we don't go extinct.
Yeah.
And so, you know, is all of this worthless if we don't get to science-based reductions in time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me clarify a few things, and the model currently is only focused on, I mean, I should really use the word adaptation because I know the word mitigation is loaded, and I think people have warned us of that, but it's kind of in the literature, people use the two words, like the FEMA uses the word mitigation, and I thought FEMA was the authority, but of course, academics, when they think about, and also many of you in the audience, when they think about mitigation, they think about reducing emissions, right, as a way of reducing these frequent disasters. The model currently is, you should think of it as adaptation, right? That's where we're not really dealing with the this XD, this distribution mitigation, you could interpret, and we're kind of working on that, you could interpret that this type of spending is more like decarbonization, and that you're going to basically, this is at an aggregate level, right? And it benefits everybody, okay? So this XD has multiple interpretations. Right now, we're just interpreting this as like, XE is individual households defending their property, defending their capital. XD is that in the region, right, we make some types of investment that will curtail the fat tails associated with that. That could be a seawall. Does that make sense? And so we're not kind of dealing explicitly with the emissions problem, right? We're kind of just saying that, look, in a world where we're not dealing with emissions and we have these things, what are the consequences of that? So we're doing an extension of the paper where we're going to introduce a fossil fuel input. Then we're going to interpret the XD so that now there's two margins where you can do this mitigation. You could do kind of property mitigation, or you could do some policy XD that's kind of now going to be an agglomeration of a seawall with mitigation, with reduction of emissions. So that's first comment. Second comment is, this paper actually is a strict public finance paper in the sense that the tax to get you that is straight exactly to what was common. This is just kind of a Pigouvian tax, right? So there's no markets really here. The markets, to your point, cannot achieve anything here, right? You really need basically this Pigouvian tax, right? This what we call a capital tax is really just a Pigouvian tax. In other contexts, I think kind of what you're referring to is that there's a whole set of other incentives, and this is what I think Ben was referring to in his keynote, is that institutions now, right, have these incentives with their holdings, with these net zero pledges, to send signals to markets for corporations to, I think that's what you're talking about. You're skeptical ESG. So we'll talk about that some other day. I'm actually very optimistic, actually. So I'm actually more optimistic about financial markets than I was previously not optimistic, but I'm actually kind of more optimistic than I think what is alluded to. For the following reason, is that carbon taxes are not being implemented, right? Your kind of best bet at this point is to use the supervisory ability, right? And by the way, the other thing is I'll comment, a lot of the ESG conversation that people talk about, it kind of in America, it gets talked about in an innocuous way because the central bank really only has a mandate to do inflation and employment. And if you talk about climate, the senator from West Virginia will say you cannot be on the board. But that's not really true in Europe. Right? That's not true in Europe. The ECB, all of the European regulators are super comfortable because their mandates are much broader. And what I view the ESG coming from is it's really coming from Europe. And the institutions in Europe have been kind of leading the way in terms of sending these market signals. And I think really American institutions are having to play some catch up essentially in terms of a lot of the signals that are being sent. And I think there's a very easy case to be made that if you had enough capital, in that sense, it sounds like it's a capital tax, and maybe that's what was kind of you were into, that if you have enough of these restrictions, that could send enough incentives for corporations to decarbonize. Maybe they'll make the Paris 2050, maybe they won't, but at least, something is being decarbonized. And I think that these market signals are being sent, so.
Thank you.
Yep.
Doug?
Empirical test for the model. If in general the belief shock is going to be highly correlated with the capital shock, is it useful to think about neighbors to a given country that experience not the capital shock, but maybe 10% of the belief shock or something like that, or another dimension of similarity to try and disentangle those two?
Yeah. No, I think that I think it's possible. Obviously you need kind of this nice counterfactual of exactly kind of the neighbor who gets one shock and then kind of doesn't get the other shock. But I think that would be a very terrific topic to talk about. Because I think if you look at the Shang-Jina paper, right, there's an awful lot of persistence in the growth rates that are kind of somewhat mysterious, right? And think about Puerto Rico. I was going to do a Puerto Rico slide as a kind of a a thing, but like Puerto Rico still hasn't recovered. Now, there could be many different reasons for that, but it's also true that Puerto Rico has gotten a lot of knock-on additional storms, you know. So it would be kind of interesting, I think, because the thing that we don't see a little bit is that at the country level, right, is the arrival of a storm going to raise you unconditionally, right? Sorry, conditionally, will your next thing be kind of hit? I think people haven't really looked at that in this literature. I mean, that I think in this model is really the source of a lot of the persistence. That's one source. The other source, of course, is that it's also bad news. And when there's bad news, right, people are also going to invest less in this model. So investment is also lower. So you get kind of that effect as well. You also get kind of a Q effect. So there's kind of multiple channels that generate more persistence in growth rates for your typical country than I think really Americans. You know, Americans, we're kind of like, you know, everything is always hunky-dory, you know, but like I think in the rest of the world, these other effects are a lot more bigger and persistent than we typically see in the US. Great, thanks. That's the final word. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists and for all the audience questions. Thank you.
Well, just a couple of final words. First of all, thank you all for coming and sticking around on a Friday. It's impressive. I think it's my first conference in person for 2.5 years. I suspect for many of you as well. I want to thank the moderators and the speakers. I want to thank two colleagues here in New York, Andy Howard and David Erickson, who helped me put the program together with our two colleagues from Columbia, Doug Almond and Wolfram Schleicher. And last but not least, you probably have noticed that this was very smooth. And that was because we had a great team that supported us. Thank you all.